A private investigator investigating police corruption was found with an axe embedded in his skull in a London pub car park, leaving his family shattered and desperate for answers. But 34 years later, an independent panel discovers the shocking truth about why authorities never wanted this case solved, and how they actively protected the killers while systematically destroying the family who dared to seek justice. The year was 1984 when Daniel Morgan decided to start his own detective agency in the bustling streets of South London. At 35 years old, this former farm boy from Wales possessed something that made him exceptionally good at his job, an extraordinary memory for details that others would easily forget. Car registration numbers, faces, conversations, dates, Daniel could recall them all with remarkable precision. Southern Investigations, the company he founded in Thornton Heath, quickly gained a reputation for taking on cases that others would not touch. Daniel was not your typical private investigator. Where others saw only surface-level problems, he saw connections, patterns, and deeper truths waiting to be exposed. His keen eye for detail and relentless pursuit of facts made him both valuable and dangerous in equal measure. But Daniel was not working alone. He had entered into a business partnership with Jonathan Rees, a man whose connections ran deep into the underground networks of South London. Rees brought clients and contacts, while Daniel brought his exceptional investigative skills and unwavering moral compass. On paper, it seemed like the perfect combination for a successful detective agency. However, beneath the surface of this partnership, tensions were building. Daniel had begun to notice irregularities in some of their cases, inconsistencies that troubled his methodical mind. Money was changing hands in ways that did not make sense. Information was being shared with people who should not have access to it. Most troubling of all, police officers were becoming far too comfortable with certain aspects of their business. As 1987 approached, Daniel found himself investigating something that would ultimately seal his fate: police corruption within the Metropolitan Police Force. His exceptional memory had allowed him to piece together a web of relationships between officers, criminals, and private investigators that painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption in South London. Daniel had discovered that some police officers were not just turning a blind eye to criminal activity, they were actively participating in it. Drug dealers were receiving protection, evidence was being manipulated, investigations were being sabotaged from within. The very people sworn to uphold justice were profiting from its destruction. What made Daniel particularly dangerous to these corrupt networks was his methodical approach to building cases. He did not rely on rumors or speculation. Every allegation was backed by evidence. Every connection was documented. Every pattern was carefully mapped out. He was building a comprehensive case that could bring down numerous officers and expose decades of institutional corruption. But Daniel was not the only one who knew what he was investigating. Word had begun to spread through the tight-knit community of police officers, private investigators, and criminals who operated in South London. The man with the exceptional memory was asking too many questions and getting too close to answers that powerful people desperately wanted to keep buried. By early 1987, Daniel Morgan had become a problem that needed to be solved. He possessed information that could destroy careers, end corrupt partnerships, and send numerous people to prison. More importantly, he had the evidence to prove it, and the determination to see justice done. The stage was set for a confrontation that would rock the foundations of British law enforcement and expose a level of institutional corruption that authorities would spend decades trying to hide. March 10, 1987 started as an ordinary Tuesday evening for Daniel Morgan. The 37-year-old private investigator had arranged to meet his business partner Jonathan Rees at the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham, a working-class area of South London where both men were well known. Earlier that evening, around 6:30, Daniel had met with Margaret Harrison, a woman with whom he was having an affair, at a wine bar in Thornton Heath. Their relationship was complicated. Daniel was married with 2 young children, but his marriage had been strained by the pressures of his work and the dangerous territory his investigations had led him into. Margaret would later recall that Daniel seemed unusually tense that evening. He was distracted, constantly checking his watch, and kept glancing toward the entrance of the wine bar, as if expecting someone unwelcome to walk through the door. When she asked him about it, Daniel simply said he had important business to discuss with Jonathan that could not wait. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel left Margaret and drove his BMW to the Golden Lion pub. The pub was a typical South London establishment, dimly lit, frequented by locals, and the kind of place where conversations could be held without attracting unwanted attention. It was exactly the type of venue that Jonathan Rees preferred for their more sensitive business discussions. Daniel and Jonathan spent approximately an hour inside the pub, though witnesses would later provide conflicting accounts of their demeanor during this time. Some claimed they appeared to be having a heated discussion, while others insisted their conversation seemed routine. What everyone agreed on was that both men left the pub separately, with Daniel heading toward the car park where he had left his vehicle. The Golden Lions car park was poorly lit, tucked away behind the main building where it could not be easily observed from the street. It was the perfect location for someone who wanted to conduct business away from prying eyes, or for someone who wanted to commit a crime without witnesses. At approximately 9:21 in the evening, Daniel Morgan's life came to a brutal end. Someone approached him as he reached his BMW, and without warning, struck him in the head with an axe. The weapon penetrated his skull with such force that it became embedded, making it impossible for the attacker to remove it quickly. The killer, or killers, fled the scene immediately, leaving Daniel's body crumpled next to his car, with the axe still protruding from his head. It was a death designed to send a message. This was what happened to people who asked too many questions and threatened the wrong people. Daniel's body was discovered shortly after 10 o'clock by pub customers who had come outside to leave. The scene was immediately cordoned off, and within minutes, police officers from the local Catford station had arrived to begin their investigation. What happened next would prove to be one of the most shocking aspects of this entire case. Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery, based at Catford Police Station, was assigned as the lead investigator for Daniel Morgan's murder. On the surface, this seemed routine. Fillery was an experienced officer with a solid reputation within the force. But there was something that Fillery did not reveal to his superiors, something that should have immediately disqualified him from investigating this case. Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery had been working unofficially for Southern Investigations, the very company that Daniel Morgan had co-owned. Fillery had been providing information and services to the detective agency, creating a massive conflict of interest that he deliberately concealed. Even more troubling was the fact that Fillery was among the police officers that Daniel had been investigating for corruption. The man tasked with finding Daniel's killer was potentially one of the very people that Daniel had been preparing to expose. From the very first moments of the investigation, the case was compromised. Evidence was mishandled, witnesses were not properly interviewed, and crucial forensic opportunities were lost. Whether this was due to incompetence or deliberate sabotage would become a question that haunted the case for decades. Within hours of Daniel's death, word had spread throughout the interconnected networks of police officers, private investigators, and criminals who operated in South London. The man who had threatened to expose their corrupt system was dead, and the investigation into his murder was being handled by someone who had every reason to ensure it never succeeded. The investigation into Daniel Morgan's murder was compromised before it even began, but the full extent of this corruption would not become clear for many years. Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery's concealment of his relationship with Southern Investigations was just the tip of an iceberg that ran deep into the heart of the Metropolitan Police. As Fillery took control of the crime scene and began directing the initial investigation, he was making decisions that would later be revealed as deliberate attempts to protect those responsible for Daniel's death. Evidence that should have been collected was ignored. Witnesses who might have provided crucial information were not interviewed. Forensic opportunities that could have identified the killer were allowed to slip away. But Fillery was not working alone in this cover-up. The corruption that Daniel had been investigating involved multiple officers across different ranks and departments. These men had built careers on their ability to manipulate the system, and Daniel's murder presented them with their greatest challenge yet: how to investigate a crime that they may have been involved in committing. Within weeks of the murder, cracks began to appear in the official investigation. Daniel's family, led by his brother Alistair, started asking uncomfortable questions about the lack of progress. Why had no arrests been made? Why were potential witnesses not being interviewed? Why did it seem like the investigation was moving backward instead of forward? The first major break in the case came in April 1987, just 1 month after Daniel's murder. Acting on what appeared to be new intelligence, police arrested 6 people on suspicion of murder. The list of those arrested was shocking in its implications. Jonathan Rees, Daniel's business partner, was among those taken into custody. This was not entirely surprising, given the tensions that had existed between the two men and Rees's connections to South London's criminal networks. But what stunned observers was that Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery himself was also arrested, along with 2 other Metropolitan Police officers. Also arrested were Glenn and Gary Vian, 2 brothers with extensive criminal records who were connected to Jonathan Rees through family relationships. The Vian brothers were exactly the type of men who would be capable of carrying out a brutal murder for the right price. For a brief moment, it seemed as though justice might actually be served. 6 suspects were in custody, including police officers who appeared to be directly connected to the victim. The case seemed to be moving in the right direction. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when the investigation itself is being conducted by the same institution that harbored the corruption Daniel had been trying to expose. One by one, all 6 suspects were released without charge. The reasons given were always the same: insufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution. But those familiar with the case began to suspect that evidence was not lacking. It was being deliberately suppressed or destroyed. The release of all suspects sent a clear message to Daniel's family and to anyone else who might be considering challenging police corruption. The system would protect itself at all costs. No one would be held accountable for Daniel Morgan's murder, regardless of how overwhelming the evidence might be. Even more disturbing was what happened to Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery after his release. Rather than facing disciplinary action for his undisclosed conflict of interest, Fillery was allowed to retire from the Metropolitan Police on medical grounds. He then immediately took over Daniel Morgan's position as Jonathan Rees's business partner at Southern Investigations. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The police officer who had been tasked with investigating Daniel's murder had literally taken the dead man's place in the business partnership. It was as if Daniel had been erased from existence and replaced by one of the very people he had been investigating for corruption. Alastair Morgan watched these developments with growing horror and determination. His brother had been murdered for threatening to expose police corruption, and now those same corrupt officers were openly mocking the family's quest for justice. The message was clear: no one would be held accountable, and anyone who continued to push for answers would face the same fate as Daniel. But Alastair Morgan was not the type of man to be intimidated into silence. If the police would not investigate his brother's murder properly, then he would spend the rest of his life making sure the world knew about their failure and corruption. He had no way of knowing that this decision would lead to a 34-year battle that would ultimately expose one of the biggest corruption scandals in British police history. What followed Daniel Morgan's murder was not one failed investigation, but a systematic pattern of 5 separate inquiries that were either compromised by corruption, sabotaged from within, or deliberately steered away from the truth. Each investigation promised to be different, each claimed to have learned from the mistakes of its predecessors, and each ultimately ended in the same result: no one would be held accountable for Daniel's death. Investigation 1. The original Metropolitan Police Inquiry. The first investigation, led by the compromised Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery, set the template for all the failures that would follow. From March 1987 through early 1988, this inquiry was marked by missing evidence, uninterviewed witnesses, and investigative leads that mysteriously went nowhere. During this period, several crucial pieces of evidence either disappeared or were contaminated. The murder weapon, the axe that had been embedded in Daniel's skull, was examined for fingerprints and DNA, but the results were either inconclusive or went missing. Witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious activity around the Golden Lion pub on the night of the murder were either not interviewed at all or their statements were lost. Most disturbing of all, it became clear that information about the investigation was being leaked to the very people who should have been primary suspects. Jonathan Rees and his associates seemed to know about investigative moves before they happened, allowing them to prepare alibis and coordinate their responses. The inquest into Daniel's death in April 1988 provided the first public glimpse into just how compromised this investigation had become. Witness testimony revealed that Jonathan Rees had allegedly told Kevin Lennon, an accountant at Southern Investigations, that police officers at Catford Station were either going to murder Daniel themselves or arrange for his death. Even more shocking was the revelation that Rees had specifically mentioned that Sid Fillery would take Daniel's place in their partnership. When directly questioned about these allegations at the inquest, Jonathan Rees denied any involvement in Daniel's murder. But the damage had been done. It was now clear that the investigation had been compromised from day one, and that those responsible for finding Daniel's killer had instead protected them. Investigation 2. Hampshire Police takes over. Recognizing that the Metropolitan Police could not credibly investigate a case involving their own officers, authorities turned the investigation over to Hampshire Constabulary in June 1988. This decision was welcomed by Daniel's family, who hoped that an outside force might finally bring objectivity to the case. Hampshire Police approached the case with apparent seriousness, conducting fresh interviews and re-examining evidence. In February 1989, they achieved what seemed like a breakthrough. Jonathan Rees and his associate Paul Goodridge were formally charged with Daniel's murder, while Goodridge's girlfriend, Jean Wisdon, was charged with perverting the course of justice. For the first time since Daniel's death, it appeared that justice might actually be served. The charges were based on new evidence that Hampshire police had uncovered, evidence that the original Metropolitan Police investigation had somehow overlooked or ignored. But this moment of hope was short-lived. In May 1989, just 3 months after the charges were filed, the Crown Prosecution Service made a stunning announcement. The case was being dropped due to insufficient evidence to secure convictions. The official explanation was that key witnesses had become unreliable and that crucial evidence had been compromised. But those familiar with the case suspected that the same corrupt networks that had sabotaged the first investigation had found ways to undermine the second one as well. Hampshire Police's 1989 report to the Police Complaints Authority claimed that no evidence whatsoever had been found of police involvement in Daniel's murder. This conclusion directly contradicted the testimony that had emerged during the inquest and raised serious questions about the thoroughness of their investigation. Investigation 3, Operation Nigeria and Two Bridges. The third attempt to solve Daniel Morgan's murder came nearly a decade later, in 1998, when Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner Roy Clark secretly launched an intelligence-gathering operation. This investigation, known as Operation Nigeria, took a different approach by focusing on the ongoing criminal activities of Jonathan Rees and his associates, rather than trying to solve the original murder directly. During this investigation, Southern Investigations Office was bugged by a police informant, providing authorities with unprecedented access to the conversations and activities of the key suspects. What they discovered was a web of corruption that extended far beyond Daniel Morgan's murder. The surveillance revealed that Jonathan Rees was actively involved in criminal conspiracies, including attempts to pervert the course of justice in unrelated cases. In December 2000, Rees was convicted of conspiring to plant cocaine on an innocent woman to discredit her in a child custody battle. He was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, the first time anyone connected to Daniel's murder had faced serious criminal consequences. But even this success was limited in its scope. While Rees was imprisoned for his other crimes, the question of Daniel's murder remained unresolved. The evidence gathered during Operation Nigeria had provided valuable intelligence about the corrupt networks operating in South London, but it had not produced the smoking gun needed to charge anyone with Daniel's death. Investigation 4, Abelard 1. The fourth investigation, conducted from 2002 to 2003, marked a significant escalation in the resources devoted to the case. Detective Superintendent David Cook was appointed to lead this inquiry, bringing with him a reputation for integrity and a determination to finally solve the case that had become a symbol of police corruption. Cook's team employed sophisticated surveillance techniques, including bugs placed in suspects' cars and homes. They recorded thousands of hours of conversations between Glenn Vian and other suspects, hoping to capture admissions or evidence that could finally crack the case. Cook himself described Daniel's murder as one of the worst-kept secrets in southeast London, claiming that a whole cabal of people knew the identity of at least some of those involved. His public statement suggested confidence that the investigation was finally moving in the right direction. The surveillance operation did yield significant intelligence. Investigators were able to map out the relationships between corrupt police officers, private investigators, and criminals with unprecedented detail. They identified potential motives, established timelines, and gathered evidence that seemed to point toward specific suspects. But once again, when the evidence was presented to the Crown Prosecution Service, the decision was made not to proceed with charges. The official explanation was that while the evidence was suggestive, it was not strong enough to secure convictions in court. Investigation 5, Abelard 2. The fifth and final major investigation began in 2006, when Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Ian Blair acknowledged that the first inquiry had been compromised and authorized another attempt to solve the case. This investigation would be the most extensive yet, involving hundreds of officers and costing millions of pounds. Detective Superintendent David Cook continued to lead the investigation, and his team made use of every modern forensic and surveillance technique available. They re-examined physical evidence using updated technology, conducted fresh interviews with witnesses, and placed extensive surveillance on all the primary suspects. In April 2008, this investigation achieved what seemed like the ultimate breakthrough. 5 people were arrested and charged in connection with Daniel's murder: Jonathan Rees, Glenn and Gary Vian, James Cook, a builder with connections to the group, and former Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery. The charges were serious and specific. Rees and the others were charged with murder, while Fillery was charged with perverting the course of justice. After more than 20 years, it appeared that Daniel Morgan's killers would finally face trial. The case that went to trial in 2009 seemed solid. Prosecutors had surveillance evidence, witness testimony, and forensic evidence that they claimed proved the defendant's guilt. The trial was expected to last several months and to finally provide the answers that Daniel's family had been seeking for more than 2 decades. But what happened next would prove to be the most devastating failure yet, a complete collapse that would reveal the true extent of police corruption and incompetence in the Daniel Morgan case. By 2009, the prosecution of Jonathan Rees, the Vian brothers, James Cook, and former Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery represented the culmination of over 20 years of investigation into Daniel Morgan's murder. The case had consumed enormous resources, involved hundreds of police officers, and generated more than 750,000 documents of evidence. When the trial began at the Old Bailey, London's most prestigious criminal court, it seemed that justice would finally be served. The prosecution team was led by some of Britain's most experienced barristers, and they expressed confidence that they had built an unshakable case against the defendants. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Surveillance recordings captured conversations between the defendants that seemed to reference their involvement in Daniel's murder. Witness testimony placed them at relevant locations at crucial times. Forensic evidence linked them to the crime scene. After decades of failed investigations, it seemed that the truth was finally going to emerge. But from the very beginning of the trial, problems began to surface. Problems that would ultimately reveal the most shocking aspect of the entire Daniel Morgan case. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of several supergrass witnesses, criminals who had agreed to testify against the defendants in exchange for reduced sentences or other benefits. These witnesses claimed to have direct knowledge of the conspiracy to murder Daniel Morgan, and their testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. However, as the trial progressed, it became clear that the police had failed to properly disclose crucial information about these witnesses to the defense. In some cases, the police had not revealed that witnesses were registered police informants. In other cases, they had not disclosed previous criminal convictions that might have affected the witnesses' credibility. In February 2010, the trial judge was forced to dismiss the first supergrass witness after it was revealed that police had failed to provide full disclosure about his background and motivations. This was a serious blow to the prosecution, but not necessarily fatal to their case. But the problems continued to mount. In November 2010, a second supergrass witness was dismissed for similar reasons. Again, the police had failed to provide complete information about the witness's background and relationship with law enforcement. By January 2011, a third supergrass witness had been dismissed, and it was becoming clear that the prosecution's case was falling apart. The pattern of police failures was not random, it appeared to be systematic and deliberate. The most shocking revelation came when it was discovered that some of the dismissed witnesses were not just informants, they were actively working for the police at the same time they were supposedly providing independent testimony about the defendants. The police had essentially been directing their own witnesses while pretending that the testimony was coming from independent sources. But the problems extended far beyond compromised witnesses. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the police had also mishandled physical evidence in ways that bordered on the criminal. The 750,000 documents that had been assembled during the various investigations should have provided a comprehensive record of everything the police had discovered about Daniel's murder. But many of these documents were not computerized, making it difficult to search them effectively. More troubling still, crucial documents kept going missing or turning up in unexpected places. In March 2011, 4 additional crates of material that had not been disclosed to the defense were discovered by accident. These documents contained information that could have been crucial to the defense's case, but they had been withheld from the defendant's lawyers throughout the trial preparation process. This discovery followed earlier problems with crates of documents being mislaid and then found by chance in storage areas throughout Scotland Yard. It became clear that the police could not even properly manage their own evidence, let alone present it coherently in court. Nicholas Hilliard QC, representing the Crown Prosecution Service, was forced to acknowledge that the police could no longer be trusted to ensure that the defense had access to all relevant documents. The prosecution's case had been fatally undermined by police incompetence and apparent deliberate misconduct. On March 15, 2011, Director of Public Prosecutions Sir Keir Starmer made the devastating announcement that the prosecution was abandoning the case entirely. Jonathan Rees and the Vian brothers were acquitted of all charges, not because they had been proven innocent, but because the police failures had made it impossible to guarantee them a fair trial. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Madison, acknowledged that the police had ample grounds to justify the arrest and prosecution of the defendants, but that the systematic failures had made prosecution impossible. He praised the prosecution for being principled in their decision to abandon the case rather than proceed with compromised evidence. Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell, the Metropolitan Police's senior homicide officer, was forced to issue a public apology to Daniel's family. He acknowledged that police corruption was a debilitating factor in the original investigation and admitted that the current investigation had revealed how the initial inquiry failed the family and wider public. But for Daniel's family, these apologies felt hollow after 24 years of systematic failures. Alastair Morgan watched the defendants walk free from the Old Bailey and realized that his brother's killers would never face justice through the traditional criminal system. The collapse of the trial represented more than just another failed investigation. It was proof that the corruption Daniel had been investigating was still alive and well within the Metropolitan Police. The same institutional problems that had allowed his murder to happen in 1987 were still protecting his killers in 2011. But Alastair Morgan was not ready to give up his fight for justice. If the criminal courts could not deliver accountability, then perhaps other avenues might prove more successful. Little did he know that the most shocking revelations about his brother's case were still to come. In 2013, something unprecedented happened in the Daniel Morgan case. Theresa May, then serving as Home Secretary, announced the establishment of an independent panel to examine the murder and the police response to it. For the first time since Daniel's death, the investigation would be conducted entirely outside the Metropolitan Police. The Daniel Morgan Independent Panel, chaired by Baroness Nala Olone, was given extraordinary powers to examine all aspects of the case. They had access to police files, witness statements, surveillance records, and internal documents that had never been made public. Their mandate was simple but profound: discover the truth about what had happened to Daniel Morgan and why no one had ever been held accountable. What the panel discovered over the next 8 years would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of corruption in the Metropolitan Police. The panel's investigation revealed that the failure to solve Daniel Morgan's murder was not just the result of incompetence or isolated corruption. It was the product of what they termed institutional corruption at the highest levels of the Metropolitan Police. According to the panel's findings, the Metropolitan Police had deliberately prioritized protecting their own reputation over finding Daniel's killer. Senior commanders had made conscious decisions to conceal evidence, obstruct investigations, and mislead the public in order to avoid admitting the extent of corruption within their ranks. The panel found evidence of a culture within the Met in 1987 that allowed very close association between police officers investigating Daniel's murder and individuals linked to crime. This was not a case of a few rogue officers acting on their own. It was systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of the organization. Even more shocking was the panel's discovery that this institutional corruption had continued right up to the present day. The Metropolitan Police had actively obstructed the panel's own investigation, placing hurdles in their path and limiting their access to crucial information. The panel specifically criticized Cressida Dick, who served as Metropolitan Police Commissioner from 2017 to 2022. During her earlier career as an assistant commissioner, Dick had initially refused to recognize the necessity for the panel to have access to Holmes, a crucial database system that could have provided vital information about the case. The panel's report, published in June 2021, was devastating in its conclusions. In over 1,200 pages, they documented not just the original corruption that had allowed Daniel's murder to go unsolved, but the ongoing institutional corruption that had continued to protect those responsible for more than 3 decades. Concealing or denying failings for the sake of the organization's public image is dishonesty on the part of the organization for reputational benefit and constitutes a form of institutional corruption, the panel concluded. The report found that multiple police failures over many years, the death of witnesses and the passage of time, mean that it is most unlikely there will be a successful prosecution for Daniel Morgan's murder. But the panel went further, stating that in failing to acknowledge its many failings over the 34 years since the murder of Daniel Morgan, the Metropolitan Police's first objective was to protect itself. In doing so, it compounded the suffering and trauma of the family. The publication of the panel's report created a political earthquake. Home Secretary Priti Patel described it as deeply alarming and called the Morgan case one of the most devastating episodes in the history of the Metropolitan Police. When asked whether Met Police Commissioner Cressida Dick should resign in light of the report's findings, Daniel's brother Alistair responded without hesitation, absolutely she should. The report represented a complete vindication of everything that Alistair Morgan had been saying for 34 years. His brother had been murdered for investigating police corruption, and that same corruption had then protected his killers while systematically destroying the family's quest for justice. But perhaps most shocking of all was the panel's conclusion that this institutional corruption was not just a historical problem. It continued to exist within the Metropolitan Police in 2021, more than 3 decades after Daniel's murder. The Daniel Morgan case had become more than just an unsolved murder. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with British policing and a test case for whether powerful institutions could be held accountable for their failures. The publication of the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel Report in 2021 marked a turning point in one of Britain's most notorious unsolved cases. For 34 years, Daniel's family had been dismissed, ignored, and actively obstructed in their quest for justice. Now finally, an official government report had vindicated everything they had been saying. The panel's findings were unambiguous. Daniel Morgan had been murdered because of his investigation into police corruption, and that same corruption had then protected his killers for more than 3 decades. The Metropolitan Police had engaged in institutional corruption by prioritizing their reputation over justice. But vindication alone was not enough for Daniel's family. In December 2021, they announced their intention to sue the Metropolitan Police for the decades of suffering caused by their failures and cover-ups. The lawsuit represented more than just a quest for financial compensation. It was an attempt to force the Metropolitan Police to finally acknowledge their role in protecting Daniel's killers and obstructing justice. For nearly 2 more years, the case wound its way through the legal system. The Metropolitan Police initially fought the lawsuit, apparently unwilling to admit liability, even in the face of the panel's damning findings. But on July 19, 2023, exactly 36 years and 4 months after Daniel's murder, something remarkable happened. The Metropolitan Police agreed to a settlement that included both financial compensation and, more importantly, a full admission of their failures. In a public statement, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley formally acknowledged that the Met had failed Daniel's family through multiple and systemic failings over more than 3 decades. He admitted that the family had been fobbed off with empty promises, and that the police had prioritized protecting their reputation over finding Daniel's killer. The settlement represented a complete victory for Alistair Morgan and Daniel's family. After 36 years of fighting, they had forced one of Britain's most powerful institutions to publicly admit its corruption and failures. But the significance of the Daniel Morgan case extends far beyond one family's quest for justice. It has become a landmark case in the fight for police accountability and transparency. The case revealed that institutional corruption is not just about individual officers taking bribes or breaking rules. It is about entire organizations making systematic decisions to protect themselves at the expense of justice. The Metropolitan Police did not just fail to solve Daniel's murder, they actively worked to ensure it would never be solved. The Daniel Morgan case also demonstrated the importance of independent oversight of police investigations. Every investigation conducted by the Metropolitan Police itself had failed, often spectacularly. It was only when completely independent investigators were given access to the evidence that the truth finally emerged. Perhaps most importantly, the case showed that persistence and courage can eventually triumph over even the most powerful corrupt institutions. Alistair Morgan spent 36 years fighting for his brother, often standing alone against one of Britain's most powerful organizations. His refusal to accept the official lies and cover-ups ultimately forced the truth into the light. The Daniel Morgan case has become required reading for anyone studying police corruption, institutional accountability, or the importance of investigative journalism. It serves as a reminder that without constant vigilance and oversight, even institutions meant to serve justice can become instruments of injustice. Today, Southern Investigations no longer exists. Jonathan Rees and Sid Fillery have faded into obscurity. The corrupt networks they were part of have been exposed and largely dismantled. But Daniel Morgan's memory lives on as a symbol of the courage required to challenge corruption, even at the ultimate cost. His exceptional memory for details, which made him such an effective investigator, has been honored by those who refuse to let his case be forgotten. Every detail of his murder, every failure of the investigations, every act of corruption and cover-up has been meticulously documented and preserved. The case that no one wanted to solve has finally been solved, not through criminal prosecutions, but through the patient work of independent investigators and the unwavering determination of a family that refused to give up. Daniel Morgan died because he threatened to expose police corruption. 36 years later, his death has exposed corruption on a scale that he could never have imagined. In the end, the truth he died seeking has finally come to light, and his killers, while never criminally prosecuted, have been exposed for what they are. The Daniel Morgan case stands as proof that no institution is above accountability, no cover-up can last forever, and no family should ever have to fight alone for justice. It reminds us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that take decades to achieve. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that will challenge everything you think you know about justice and accountability. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep examinations into cases that reveal the hidden truths about power, corruption, and the ongoing fight for justice in our world.